Hello everyone, I am Unikaram Daddy. Today we are going to see Writeback in Power BI service using Power Apps Visual. So let's get started. So if we see my screen, the idea is if we see this cancellation reason, what if I want this cancellation reason to be editable? As an example, if a user wants to see this and see a value which he didn't expect. As an example, this shouldn't be testing data, but rather any valid information in this particular column. So how do we give the write back functionality in Power BI? And that's where Power Apps helps us. So if we look at the visualizations, we'll see Power Apps for Power BI is another visual. If we um, let's say select anywhere outside and make sure then if I add the Power Apps visual, then we'll see the Power Apps visual showing up as any other visual. And if we notice, we have certain steps to follow. As an example, it says first, provide the fields which you want the app to consume or app to, let's say, display. In this case, since I'm interested in product cancellation, I can actually see product cancellation reason, ID, and product ID so that I know which product I'm going to cancel and what's the cancellation reason. At this point, you'll see that the visualizations changes a bit and now it says create new. If I click on create new, what you'll notice is this message pops up wherein it says it is going to open the Power App Studio in a browser session and I can click on OK. And this one will take us to the Power Apps visualization or Power Apps Studio. But since I'm logged in into my Office account, I can actually switch to my normal account, a normal private session with the browser, and I can copy that same URL and paste it here. When you open it for the first time, you would notice that the data, you can actually skip this, the data is actually displayed in a gallery. Power Apps has a similar, I would say, navigation as Power BI. On the right hand side, we see some property and fields. Center is the area where we would basically design, and on the left hand side is some navigation which we have there. And we'll see slowly how those are tied up. In this case, if we see, we pass three fields. It just shows any, and it doesn't show any other data. So that could be our first exercise to see how do I make sure that I can show more than one field in here. And if I increase the first width, you will see the second and corresponding are also increasing. So it's the first width or the first object on which I can or I have to work with. If I highlight the first text, you will see on the top we have this formula bar wherein we have this item dot cancellation reason. And cancellation reason was one of the field which we passed. And if we switch back just to see, you'll see cancellation reason, ID, and product ID. So if we switch back here, I can actually copy and paste it within the same grid multiple times. And I can change their field. If I start typing, as an example, .I, you'll see the IntelliSense kick in. It says that that's ID. Then we have NA, and then we also need the product ID. So I can actually say product ID, and you'll see it is showing me product ID, cancellation reason, and the ID. Now, in this particular visual, I also want to make sure that we put some header so that we get an appropriate message on the top. And for that, I can actually insert a label by going into the insert menu. So there are other navigation which is built with many options as well. Here I want to put a label. So as soon as I hit the label, you'll see a text being added here. And as I was saying, if we highlight a object on the right hand side, we'll see its property. And one of the property is text, which we can modify, and I can say, and this is cancellation reason. And I may want it to display in the center, and I may want it to have, uh, let's say, light blue background. At this time, it looks good enough, I should say, like a form wherein I can show this information to the user. But still, it is not going to allow me to edit the data. So what if we give a user to modify a data? And in this case, I would then require a form wherein the user can edit or add a new row. In my scenario, it would be more edit. So if we see here, just on the top ribbon, we have this new screen. And if I hit the new screen drop down, you'll see that there is an option called forms. And if I add forms, you'll see on the left hand side there is another screen which got added. So we were in screen 1, wherein when we started the forms, we saw we were landed. Then we had within the form a gallery, and within the gallery we had this text boxes which we created, and then the separator. And then also there is a next arrow button which is added, which we'll see how we can modify in a later section. But if we look at the screen 2, which we just now added, the first step is to connect to a data, which means I should have the same data source which I'm using over here, just to make sure that I can actually modify the data. And in order for me to immediately show the data modification, I have kept my model into direct query mode. But we can also use mixed mode and have one table which we want to give the read write as the direct query. But in my case, I have the entire model in direct query mode. Now, if we go back to our apps forms, you'll see the form which we have is for modifying, and you'll find that on the top it's a standard template with the title, a cancel, and an OK button. But the first task is to connect to a data. If we click on connect to a data, you'll see on the left hand side there would be a navigation again. This looks a little different than our previous navigation, and you'll see that this is another navigation which is built. We were previously into tree view, wherein we could see everything in a tree-like structure. But now, since we were trying to add a data, we were actually redirected toward another navigation called read data. And then we also have option, then we have image and monitoring and audio file. For now, if I switch to data, I can click on data. Since my data is actually in a SQL Server, I can click on SQL Server. One note which you'll see, Power Apps call all of this connector, and if you see this connector is basically a premium connector. So if we use a premium connector, then our licensing requirement changes a bit, and then we would require either per apps or per user licenses in Power Apps category. So if I choose my, let's say, source as SQL Server, you would see it actually showed me that I already had a SQL Server, and it showed me a list of tables wherein I have access to. But if I don't have a SQL Server, I can actually click on SQL Server, and then if I select it, I can also say add a connection again. And this one will show me a SQL Server new dialog box wherein I can select the type of authentication. And then if we have a SQL Server on-prem, then we need to have a data gateway. Otherwise, we can use, in this case, mine was Azure SQL, I could actually directly connect using Azure SQL Server by providing a SQL Server name and then the database username and password, which I have already done. And that's why uh, you might have noticed when I clicked on SQL Server, you have this another SQL Server which is created. And I can select that, and the table which has this information which I want to use is this product cancellation. And at this time, I can click on connect. As I click on connect, you would see that on the right hand side of this particular forms, we have another properties section wherein there's one section called data sources, wherein I can click on the drop down and map it with the current data source which we have created. Now, since we want to modify, let's say, only one field, I can click on edit field and add a field. And then I want to just modify the cancellation region. So at this time, I can click on edit. What you would notice is we have this edit text. Edit text is the type of control which would allow us to modify this cancellation region. And it's important to note here that in order for Power Apps to be able to give a form with editable control, the table from where we are retrieving it need to have a key, a primary key, so that it can actually use that key to do an insert and update. So if you don't have a key, what you would notice is you will only be able to read the text. You will not be able to modify it using forms. But if we see here, we have created one source, right, which is an additional source, which is SQL Server. We also had Power BI. But how would then Power BI and SQL Server now interact with each other? Or how the data will then be passed in a way from the first gallery to this editable form? And for that, if I select, make sure that I have my form selected, and one good way to make sure is going to Preview and select this edit form. If you see the drop down on the left hand corner, you'll also see that there is a property called item, wherein I can say that, hey, the item for this particular form would come from my gallery one, because gallery one is this one, and gallery one's selected, which is if somebody select any item in the gallery, then that is what I will show. And you'll notice as soon as I make that, you have this NA showing up automatically here. At this time, I have this navigation built appropriately, wherein if somebody will select something on the gallery one and will fix that something in a minute, then it will come to this particular page with the current selection. And then we can modify the cancellation reason for that selection. But how do that modification be saved back to SQL Server? That's where this OK button is what does that, which is it's submitting the form. But we don't only want to submit the form, we also want to make sure that when we are into the Power BI service, the Power BI service would then refresh the data as well. And then it should navigate us back to screen one, which is this one. So for that, we can add this extra information here, or extra, I should say, event, which is saying Power BI integration.refresh, which is saying that, hey, I want to refresh my Power BI data, and also I want to navigate it back to screen one. I can change this title to, let's say, modify reason, modify cancellation reason. But you got the point. And I can see that it's a little big, so I can actually say cancellation reason. And what will happen when user will select this navigation? I can say that this will also navigate the user back to the screen one. So I can select, as you see, the IntelliSense is making sure that I do the right thing. So on the first page, I think I see the title, I see a way to modify it, I see to submit it, I see a way to cancel it. But how would somebody will come from gallery 1 to that page. And that's where this arrow is what we want, because we know then the user have made this selection, not this selection. So we can select the arrow, and as soon as we select the arrow, you'll see there is an event called on select. So whenever somebody will select this, we want it to navigate to screen 2. So on the effects, we can actually say we want to navigate, and we want to navigate to, let's say, screen 2. And at this time, we have a form wherein the user will see the product and product cancellation region. User will select it, and then they will get a form, and then that will modify the data. At this time, I think we are good to, uh, let's say, proceed and test it. So for that, we'll have to make sure we save it. And when we click on save, here we have to give a name, and I can call that, let's say, product cancellation. And if I click on save, you'll see now our message is prompted saying, hey, go ahead and share this, because when you share it, then the users will be able to, let's say, use it. And here it is saying, when you're sharing, you're implicitly sharing the connection information too. So make sure that the targeted audience in this case are correct. Now in this case, I just wanted to share with one of my coworker as an example, and I can click on share. Now, once we share it and we go back to our Power Apps form, what we see is it shows us the form over here, where it is showing me the cancellation reason and the product, and we can see over here. So what happens when there's no selection? And you'd see the data is instantaneously being shown, and it is filtering the same way we expect any other visualizations to work, which is if I have a slicer, the visual should filter. At this time, I can actually click on this navigation, which brings me to my cancellation region. I can modify it to testing, and I can click on OK. This is where the behavior is a little different than the Power BI desktop and Power BI service. In Power BI desktop, we the Power BI refresh, if you see, remember the event, doesn't work directly because there's no Power BI service involved in this. But when we deploy this to Power BI service, then we should be seeing the exact behavior that should modify this data. Just to make sure that we see it is being modified, I'll just make sure I'm refreshing the data, and you know that in direct query, refreshing means that just resubmitting the data or resubmitting the query for the visual, so that the visual will get the data from the source. And in this case, you see that the data is modified over here and here as well. Couple of caveat which I wanted to mention, that when you start with building the Power Apps, you'll see at the very initial time you will have this visuals showing up the data, but when you go to edit it one more time, you may see the similar navigation which comes in. You can actually take this URL and go to my Power Apps, and I can paste that in. And what you notice now is that this screen now looks a little different than the first time when we opened it. Now we don't see Power BI data getting passed. And this is what I was referring to. And also there are some additional nuances to it, which is if I just modify it by saying, I don't want to call that cancellation reason, but modify reason as an example, And then I click on file and save one more time and publish it. And even make sure that sharing is done. And you'll see there's nothing new in this. It's already shared. If I go back, if I click on back arrow, if I make sure that the visual is refreshed by making some changes, uh, you'll see that um, this visual is still not refreshing on the right hand side. You see when we make changes. And there are a couple of ways to make it work, but I just wanted to be you guys to be aware of. And one way to make it work could be I can cancel this and I can say an existing app, or I should say I can delete it, add it again, and when it prompts me to create a new app, I can choose an existing app and I can select that. Or I could wait for 15 minutes and then it will work again. But that's about it. One last thing about the licenses, which I was talking about, you should be aware of. And for licenses, you could actually see that if we go to Power Apps licenses, licensing guide, you basically see Power Apps has a different licensing than Power BI, and this is something which we should be aware of. That when you use those premium features, either you create an app, which is this option, and then share it with all the user, or give a license which is per user. So that's it for today. I hope you liked this video. Let me know if you have any questions regarding this. Thank you. Have a good day ahead.